right, good morning. Conversation about what type of insights or perspectives that these folks have who really work on the front lines and are very active in this space coming out of this historic election. How's it going to impact our economy, both at the federal level, but also at the state level, all the way down to the local level, what we might be able to expect. And the first presenter that I'm going to bring up, really excited to have him because I've heard him speak before, and some of you may have in Connecticut as well. I attended a couple chamber breakfasts in the Naugatuck Valley where he was the presenter, and I really enjoyed his presentations each time for a couple of reasons. You know, one of I listened to him present back when the state was really dealing with some very difficult economic challenges, and spent a lot of time around some other economists, and were in other economist presentations, and I found myself coming out of them at times wanting to take cyanide capsules. And then I would listen to John Traynor, and he had a very pragmatic message, but it was also a message of hope, and there was some positivity in there. And I found that most of his predictions and the things that he was bringing forward was actually more accurate than some of the doom and gloom forecasts that we were hearing from others. So, you know, again, I've enjoyed him before. Tell you a little bit about him. He directs the overall wealth management at Cambridge Trust Wealth Management of Connecticut. But he's appeared regularly on CNBC, the Nightly Business Report, and Fox Business Networks, as well as being references in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Prior to joining Cambridge Trust in 2022, John served as the CIO EVP of People's United Advisors since 2011, where he directed the overall investment process. So our first presentation this morning is from Mr. John Traynor. John?
What was that crack about most of my predictions being right? I thought they were all good. I'm going to go through this presentation fairly quickly, and I promise, as we just heard, you know, most of my compatriots love to beat up on Connecticut, and you know, we have challenges, but we have opportunities also. So I want to make sure we cover all of that. If you take a look at our forecast for next year, revolves around three things. The economy slowly cools. I mean, this year has been fantastic. If I were here a year ago, we would have been talking about the potential for a recession this year. The fact that we're growing very, very nicely, we could be close to 3% growth in the fourth quarter. We were 2.8% last quarter, is fantastic. So the economy, we believe, is going to continue growing, no recession next year, but slowing a little bit. You know, probably 2 to 2.5% growth, not where we are now. Employment slowly cools. We'll get the unemployment rate on Friday. It'll probably be impacted by the craziness that we saw last month. So, you know, the number may tick up to 4.2%, but we'll see. But we believe the underlying trend, and I've got a chart in here, will be increasing, maybe 4.5% unemployment next year, but not a disaster. Not a disaster. And we believe inflation will continue cooling. The key point that all of those three issues revolve around is employment. You know, if consumers have a job, they spend money. So the consumer sales has been driving this economy. As long as employment stays fairly strong, we believe the economy will stay fairly strong. What the Fed is probably most concerned about, though, is wage inflation. We've seen inflation come down, that headline number come down, primarily because gas prices have come down, commodity prices have come down. Wage inflation is still up. So if there is a reason for the Fed to think, maybe we don't need to cut rates as fast as people thought, it would be because of wage inflation. So all of the factors that we're looking at next year really revolve around employment. The most important relationship that we think we're going to see in 2025 is the relationship between these two men, Donald Trump and the chairman of the Fed, Mr. Powell. It will be very important for Donald Trump to, hopefully, he keeps his hands off the Fed, because we were entering this year thinking the Fed would be cutting another 100 basis points next year. A lot of people that do what I do are thinking, boy, we'll be lucky if we get 50 basis points in interest rate cuts. So there'll be a lot of pressure on the Fed to continue cutting rates, I'll show you a chart that'll show why we hope that doesn't happen, why we hope the Fed is actually a little bit tougher than what the president probably wants. So you remember the famous book, 3 Days in May? Well, I stole the title here, and I took 3 days in November to sort of coalesce what happened. Think about the economy the day before the election. We were actually in pretty good shape. I know if you listen to the headlines and the political races, you would think we were either in great shape or terrible shape. We were in good shape. Unemployment at 4%, the economy growing at 3%. Those are good numbers. You know, any of us in our entire lifetime, if that's what was going on in the economy, we would be very, very happy. Then we had the election, and it was, you know, I was telling clients we probably wouldn't know for a few days after the election. I think it's fair to say, I think everybody in the room was probably stunned by what we saw on election day. You know, the fact that Donald Trump took the swing states was not something that any of us predicted. And then the day after, and that's really where I want to spend most of my time this morning. So take a look at the United States. For the first 2 quarters of this year, every single state, except for Alaska, was growing. Connecticut, 2.8%. We were right in there. Connecticut was doing very, very well in the first part of this year, and we think Connecticut will continue to do well. But the economy, again, the day before the election, we were in great shape. Our estimate, and again, think about where we were just a year ago. We were probably thinking, oh, 2024, we're just on the cusp of a recession. What we believe has happened is that the economy's actually backed up, and we're probably closer to a mid-cycle, not early cycle. I know people are saying happy days are here again, and we're going to have a great boom, but we've moved back into a place where profit margins are still healthy, earnings are still growing, so we think we've actually moved to a better place in the economic cycle. This is that chart that I just referred you to. And again, if you grab any charts, and you can get all of these charts, this is one you might want to hold on to. I call this the rule of 4%. Now, this chart goes back to 1973. I graduated college in 1982, and you can see 1982, the unemployment rate was 10.8%. Terrible, terrible recession. But take a look at the next 40 years. Every time, I'll just describe those. The unemployment rate is that dark line at the top. Wage growth is the blue line at the bottom. Every time wage growth got up to 4%, the Fed got nervous. Every time unemployment got up above, way above that line, above 6%, the Fed got nervous. They would lower rates. The economy would or they would raise rates. They would slow the economy, and look what would happen. We'd have a recession. Unemployment would go up, wages would go down. Fed got nervous when unemployment got close to 4% and wages got close to 4%. They'd say, hold on a second, we've got to hit the brake. We'd see that widen again. Take a look at where we are right now. Unemployment and wages are both right around 4%. You will not see this in any press release out of the Fed, but what we believe the Fed is trying to do is get those lines back in order. Get unemployment up, again, maybe to 4.5% next year. See wage growth come down a little bit. What they don't want is to see those lines reversed, because that causes big problems. And this is what I think Donald Trump and Jay Powell will be arguing about. Do we get those lines back to where they've been over the last 40 years, or are we in a new zone? We believe the Fed is going to try and get them back to a more normal environment. So let's take a look at Election Day. This is a chart I'm sure you've all seen. And when I show this chart to a lot of our clients, they look at that and say, okay, the rest of the country changed, but if you look at New England, that was blue. If you look at coastal California, that was blue. So we didn't change. What took place across the country didn't impact us. Well, this is the state of Connecticut. So take a look at all of your towns. You'll see, the Naugatuck Valley, red. And you take a look at the Connecticut near Rhode Island, Connecticut near Massachusetts, red. The rest of the state, and the state went for Kamala Harris. This is a chart that I love, though. This is every one of your towns. New York Times put this out, and they've got it for every single state. Of the 169 towns in Connecticut, 150 of them moved to the right. You know, I live in Fairfield. My town moved over. Town right next to us, Bridgeport. Bridgeport moved 13% to the right. So what took place across the country certainly took place here in Connecticut also. One of the things that I think is an answer to this is this chart right here. And we could have an entire presentation just about what takes place here. That top line is productivity that we all have. The bottom line is wage growth. You can see that little line is very faint going down. What happened in the late 1970s, early 1980s to say, I'm a worker, I'm being very, very productive, but for some reason, beginning in 1980, I didn't share in those wage gains. I think this is a big reason why there's a lot of frustration, and part of the reason that Donald Trump was elected. You've got a lot of people out there saying, wait a minute, you know, I'm really working hard. I'm trying to support my family, and I'm not sharing in that. And I think that's the frustration that we're seeing. Now, China opened up in 1978. That has a big impact on it. There are a lot of factors that went into this, but the bottom line is, I think what Donald Trump has tapped into is that frustration that people are feeling that the economy's booming and I'm not participating. All right. So we talked about the day before the election. We talked about the election. Now let's talk about the day after. And if we're thinking about the big challenges that as a country, as a planet we face, deglobalization, the big issue for Connecticut, deleveraging, debt, demographics, and democracy. I'll talk about the first three. If you think about demographics, the line on the top there, that's India. The line below that is China. And if you go back early, that green line, that's us, that's the United States. Every country in the world is experiencing a demographic crisis. You're either in it right now or you will be in it shortly. Right now, if you take a look, India just passed China as the most populous country in the world. China is actually peaking. They're rolling over. Their one-child policy had a big impact on their economy, and it's going to continue. India looks like it's going to peak around 2080. Take a look at the United States, though. We're that green line. In about 2040, 2050, we'll be passed by Nigeria and Pakistan, but we'll still be the fifth largest country in the world, and the U.S. seems to be avoiding that. Why is that? Well, if you take a look at this chart, this is our U.S. population projection. That line, the second one from the top there, that's the base case. What this does is it takes a look at the U.S. population growth, and it just factors in high immigration, base case immigration, low or zero immigration. If you take a look at this, almost all of the population growth in the U.S. right now is because of immigration. The chart on the right there shows that in 2038, almost basically 100% of our population growth will be because of immigration. I say this because if you look at Connecticut, Connecticut looks a heck of a lot like China. Between, I think it was April of 2020 and July of 23, over 100% of the growth that we had in Connecticut was due to immigration. So one of the implications of the election is our national immigration policy. You know, the United States, you know, if anybody here is interested in Social Security, back in 1986, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill appointed a blue ribbon panel. Alan Greenspan led it, the Greenspan Commission. Part of the reason that they were able to save Social Security was they said the U.S. is always going to be a magnet for workers. So your Social Security, my Social Security, is partly based on continued immigration into the U.S. So we could, again, we could probably have another conversation just about immigration. I think, you know, we'd certainly love it to be legal and have everybody be citizens and all of that. All I'm saying is one of the big implications of the election for Connecticut is that immigration policy. Very, very important to every one of your towns. Now, I just talked about kind of a depressing scenario. Gee, population growth is going to be declining. What's one of the ways you can fix that? Remember the chart we looked at with productivity? This is a great chart. It takes productivity on a per capita basis by individual, but then it takes a look at it and says, okay, how many hours did that person work this week? The U.S., we work a lot. The Germans don't work as many hours. So it adjusts for that. So it really makes it look like, how productive is this person? This chart was done in 2021. That's the latest time that we have data for. The average is $21 an hour. Take a look at China. China's about $15 an hour. India is a little less than 10. Take a look at the best country in the world, the United States. $83 per hour. Yes, there's a demographic slowdown, but one of the reasons that we're positive about the U.S. economy is that we are the most productive. We have the most productive workforce in the world. Now, take a look at this. It's the same data for 2021. This is every state in the United States. Now, remember, the U.S. was 83. Take a look at Connecticut. We're 98. We were in sixth place in 2021. In 2022, we passed Massachusetts. We went up to $101 per hour. So if you're a business and you're taking a look at, gee, where do I locate my factory? And every one of the countries I want to go to has a demographic challenge. Well, to produce, you need a very good workforce. You need a very smart workforce. You need a very productive workforce. The United States is one of the best places to go. And in the U.S., Connecticut is the fifth best state to go to. We've got a very, very productive workforce. So we should still be a magnet for companies that really need a very productive workforce. One of the challenges that we have is our kids. One of the best exports that we have are our 22-year-old sons and daughters. In Connecticut, take a look, you'll see the best states and the worst areas. And unfortunately, Washington, D.C. is attracting all of our best kids. But if you take a look at the states there, you'll see the states that have a net positive. They bring in 10 kids and they hold on to 11. In Connecticut, we've got great educational institutions. We're a magnet for come to the state to get educated. For every 10 that we bring in, though, we're only able to hold on to 7. So one of the things we need to do, whether it's, Yale or UConn or Fairfield University in my town or any of the community colleges, is we've got to figure out how do we hold on to these kids, whether it's, more job opportunities, housing costs, or whatever. But we do a great job. The positive is we're doing a great job bringing smart kids from all over the country into Connecticut. We just have to figure out how to hold on to them. And that's also part of the productivity issue. The other side of Connecticut, and I know Connecticut gets bashed for this quite a bit, is I believe we might be the 4th oldest state in the country. I think Maine is the oldest. I think our average age is about 41. Maine is 44. Well, one of the positives of that is that you're also a very productive person. Take a look at this chart. This is the productivity of the U.S., and there are many reasons for it going up and down, but one of the reasons is demographics. There are probably a lot of people here that are baby boomers. The baby boomers, the start was 1946 to 1964. All right, so if you were in that range, that's where you're a baby boomer. Well, the baby boomers, the leading edge, turned 22, graduated college, 1968. So take a look. You can see where that chart, you might not be able to see, but it peaked early on, right around the late 1960s. The last baby boomers turned 22 in 1986. Look at the bottom there. Basically bottomed in that range, and then the amount of kids coming out of college, the amount of workers joining the workforce slowed down. Look at what happened to productivity. From 86 to 2005, we had a boom. a lot of reasons for this, but one of them is demographics. When you're a young person, you get out of college, you think you're the smartest person in the world, you don't know what to do. You don't know what you're doing. What you've got to do is you've got to take a look at the older people that are working in the factory, working in the office, and figure out, okay, that's how I operate. So one of the reasons why Connecticut is so productive is that we have an older workforce. So again, we've got a great workforce, we've got an older workforce. What we've got to do is figure out, okay, how do we hold on to those older workers, and how do we make sure that there are young workers that they can train? A couple of slides on deleveraging, and then I'm going to hand off the presentation. This is the United States, all right? You take a look that you've got the deficit and you've got unemployment. So naturally, going all the way back to 1969, when unemployment increases, there's more unemployment insurance, the economy slows down, so the deficit increases. A pretty good relationship until 2016. Take a look at that. Unemployment continued to move down. The economy was doing very, very well, but our deficit started to go through the roof. I know, back in the 1980s, we talked about the Reagan deficits. That's nothing compared to what we're going through right now. Take a look at where we are right now. Remember, I said unemployment at 4.1% is nirvana. That is fantastic. We're running 6 to 8% deficits on a national basis. That's not sustainable. So that's a real challenge. And it's also one of the reasons why I think that relationship between President Trump and Chairman Powell is going to be very contentious. A lot of investors are worried about this. If you take a look at the state of Connecticut, we're also in that bind. Take a look at Connecticut, the amount of debt that we each own on a per capita basis. There's a lot out there. There's a lot, Connecticut's got that challenge. The U.S. government has that challenge. So handling debt, and again, one of the outcomes of the election is, I think you're going to see a lot of debate about that. One last point that I'd like to make, again, remember we talked about the 4 Ds, deglobalization. One of the charts that I pulled out of this, just to shrink it, was a chart of the U.S., and it had the importance of exports for every single state. So Connecticut's 12.8%. Texas is 30. Washington State is 30. I think Kansas and Nebraska were close to 30. So you think about Texas, Washington, their big export is timber. They're shipping logs over to Asia. Texas oil, Kansas and Nebraska, corn and wheat, they're shipping commodities. If you take a look at Connecticut, that 12.8% is very, very important to our state because it's all very highly valued products. Our 2 biggest export markets are Canada and Germany, and they bounce back and forth. Our big export to Germany are aircraft parts. Turbine blades and jet engines, all the rest, very highly value-added products. So again, one of the impacts of the election is our trade policy and tariffs, and whether or not there are tariffs that get placed on some of the goods that we produce. We're not producing commodities that, well, okay, if we have a little fight with China, we can sell our corn to, another country. You're producing an aircraft engine. It's usually custom made for that airline, and it's got to go there. So the tariffs, tariff policy will have a big impact on Connecticut. So of those 4 Ds, I think the top 3 there all have a big impact on Connecticut, but there are opportunities. We've got a great workforce. We're positioned very well. We've just got to make sure we keep bringing in those young people. So I'm going to stop there and hand it off to the good professor.
As we get into looking at the Connecticut outlook, the Connecticut economy, I just want to mention that I had the good fortune of and still serve on Connecticut Innovations Board, and we'll make some passing reference to that great resource that this state has of people working across sectors on investing in the state, and then Advanced CT, which is a fully volunteer independent authority that I had co-chaired. Jim Smith, one of your competitors, of course, the great star of Webster Bank, and Ingenuity were my predecessors, and I was on with another one of your competitors as a co-chair, Margaret Keane, and the CEO of Amphenol was our successor, who just took over Adam Norwitt with Judy Olean from Quinnipiac. But that's a great group, and it got me to appreciate even more issues going on within Connecticut and Connecticut economic development. I had gone to college with the governor. And actually, he and I both went to college with the nominee for Health and Human Services. We'll talk about that later, though. And with Governor Lamont, when he was not governor, we had a reunion for our Harvard College class, and GE had just announced they were leaving the state. And we had the reunion in Boston, so we pulled together the mayor of Boston, the head of city council, some major corporate leaders from Boston, and all they did was complain about how GE had an inflated view of what Boston had to offer them. So, we were thrilled to hear that. And he said, why don't we come back and do something like that here in Connecticut? So we came back and we held the first economic forum for the state. This is, I guess, now 6 years ago. And it was a pretty negative event. We had the GE leadership team there, but in fact, we had what we're told was the most representative set of leaders from the state in the state's history, going back to even pre-revolution, even for both constitutional conventions. It was amazing who was there, from the NAACP to the AFL-CIO to Community Fund, United Way, the major life sciences companies, insurance companies. Yes, we'd be happy to know a great collection of mayors, but advanced manufacturing. The governor was there at the time, Governor Malloy, and it was the day where he was announcing taxation on the state's hospitals that was not extremely popular, and we had a lot of media there that wanted to talk to him right away. So he warned us that he was just going to do a hit and run. And just between us, because we are a family here now, is everybody was a little bit relieved, because everybody, no matter who they were, wanted to say something critical, and they didn't want to offend Governor Malloy. But then he looked and he saw who was there, and he said, I see 5 people in this room who want my job. And that was Ted Kennedy was there, and Governor Lamont was there. But then, Jim Smith kind of mumbled, well, I was maybe, and then Osgrable said, well, I too, and then it started going on and on. Greg Butler, also from Evercore, and then a great legislator, I'll keep her name out of it, but who he wound up dating after that event. She too was going to run, and they wound up getting married at this event. So we thought, well, other than that matrimony, it was a pretty downbeat event. Such finger pointing, such anger, as you were referring to, Joe, and how transformed it was. We did one last year with all the same people there. The sense of can-do optimism was tangible, but there also was such a success track record across sectors, across parties. It's just amazing how the spirit of this state has changed. So if I say any things in a high-speed tour, or when I have the benefit of Greg's panel coming up, where I get pushed into a corner of saying anything which is constructively critical, please know that I'm very enthusiastic about where the state is economically, but also your role in it. As municipal leaders, is not only through advanced CT and Connecticut innovation do I understand how this cross-sector partnership is so critical. And I've been working in economic development in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Georgia before that. We wound up creating something so shriekingly obvious. You would have thought some university would have done it a long time ago, which is a school for the mayors, the first World Mayors College, and Mayor Pissarro has even come to these events and says he's coming back. And who else is from New London? And Mayor Reiling, I think if I haven't scared you away already, is he's scheduled to be joining us from Norwalk, as we bring together about 100 mayors a year to join mayors around the country to look at these issues. And it's very much in terms of what Fiorello LaGuardia once said, that there's no such thing as a Democrat or Republican sewer break. You just have to fix it. And that's the spirit that we realized on the municipal level There was once a great book. The best part of the book is the title, If Only Mayors Ran the World. But there's just something about problem solving where you know your constituents, you know them personally, you can't hide from the accountability issues, you don't have a lot of bureaucracy to hide behind, and it's pandering to the crowd, but to be here before you, in addition to this galaxy of stars, the municipal leaders, I'm just thrilled. Now, they do try to work like you in new realities, cutting across some of the different challenges that we have as leadership changes. I've known both these guys for a very long time. I was the first critic of the Apprentice TV show, which had him threatening me with all sorts of litigation. Believe it or not, we wound up becoming friends. It's a long story. Joe Biden, I worked on his campaigns since 1972. Yes, I'm that old too. That there are issues that both they bring to us in their administrations that have got us some opportunities and some issues that bring us some challenges. I was going to be an equal opportunity offender, but I'll save it for the panel if we have time, about the late night jokes which have come out about both of these guys for the late night comics in just the last few days. But instead, looking back at this state, there's nothing to laugh at. There's a lot to celebrate, and we have been focusing on this, as Joe mentioned, that in terms of the local press, this top article is where he mentioned Indra and Jim Smith and Margaret and myself, is this was celebrating what Advanced CT has done to help in your various cities and towns in working with the business leaders across. But these are the 5 areas that we'll touch on just each one lightly, because I know Greg's going to want to drill down in more detail. But where these changing leadership policies matter in defense, life sciences, advanced manufacturing, emerging technologies, fintech, education, and then, of course, where John just left off with us on education and workforce issues, is in defense. Connecticut still has the highest concentration of defense aerospace manufacturing in the country. It's 135,000 total jobs. A state our size, that's a lot of jobs. And it's almost 10% of the state's GDP. Number 1 of any state in the nation by far, representing 17,000 jobs on aircraft engines and parts manufacturing. It's almost a 30% growth in jobs during the Lamont administration, and this is something to be quite proud of. Shipbuilding, similarly, 15% of all shipbuilding and repairs. We know that, not to be pandering to a mayor from New London and just down the road from there, of course, with Groton, is number 2 of any state, employing 12,000 people, 35% increase in jobs during Lamont's administration. When measured by gross state product, aircraft shipbuilding represent $10 billion combined in the state. Now, what worries us, of course, we put in red, is even beyond controversy surrounding the Secretary of Defense nominee, who may be going up in flames today. I don't know. Trump has a long history of pitting defense companies against each other. If I knew you better, I would show you personal emails I have from the CEOs of Lockheed and Boeing in the spring of 2017, who were just horrified that they were put up in public battles over highly sensitive national security issues as defense contractors, literally, honest to God, over chocolate cake in public at Mar-a-Lago. Is that kind of stuff is, he loves a battle. Canada versus Mexico, Germany versus France, Lockheed versus Boeing, is Merck and Pfizer and things versus Johnson & Johnson. And that divide and conquer scheme has often worked well for him, but there's a destructive side to this, and that can have effects on the Connecticut economy. We can turn to in the Pentagon contracting process, because there's a lot that's up for grabs right now, especially in submarines and helicopters, and we've lost a little bit in some helicopters, and it isn't because we don't have the best leadership with Jeff Lembo and all at Sikorsky. But still, politics tie in. When a job that we think should have gone to Connecticut winds up in Texas, then you start to ask questions behind it all. Business executives, as President Trump said, should be 100% behind Donald Trump, and that's anybody should be fired for incompetence, is what he said on Truth Social. I'm very happy, by the way. He posted something favorable about me last night on Truth Social, so I guess we're still getting along. But Connecticut is one of the largest beneficiaries of Defense Department-funded contracting. There is that, I talked about where we are is in terms of employment relative Connecticut to Connecticut, but how about relative to other states? This is how we rank so highly. It's quite impressive. And this has not just been some sudden fluke. It's been a consistent, a continuous trend that we're doing very, very well. Then what does worry us, is we've got great companies here, and we have to make sure that we do everything we can to help. General Dynamics, Electric Boat, of course, and RTX, the old Raytheon, as you all know, is Pratt & Whitney, and Lockheed is Sikorsky, and all these other great companies that Connecticut accounts for half of General Dynamics' as revenues, and over a third of Raytheon's total Defense Department funded contracts through Pratt & Whitney. So it matters to them. Congress faced competing plans to cover submarine construction, and we can talk about that if we have time. If not, Greg is the expert on all this, but I can pretend to know something about it too in terms of what's shifted. Thousands of Connecticut jobs in play as Trump weighs national defense. What we know about this billion-dollar deal, for Huntington Ingalls is the company in Newport News, I believe. So, and what's happened in the lifetime of everybody in this room, in the career of everybody in this room, in the recent career of everybody in this room? It's amazing what's happened here. I don't want to be too controversial and tell you what Connecticut gets back for $1 of revenue. If you invite me next year, I'll tell you. It isn't something you like to hear versus what Texas and Florida get for $1 of revenue and they put in. But we are funding the Sun Belt, and there's no question about that. We don't have the same hurricanes. We don't have, and this is true going back through history, we don't have no-fault walk-away mortgages like the Sun Belt always has. People are accountable here, and we do the bailouts from here. But in particular on defense contracting, look at that. Look at the down 4.6 from the Base Closure Act in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic at 2.4, and it's up in the Sun Belt, and there's particular states there. So, this is a worry. For those of you who are old enough like I am and remember some of these names, I'm from Philadelphia originally, is that the Philadelphia Naval Yard just wasn't a big Navy yard. It was the biggest in the world. It's gone. The Philadelphia Naval Air Station is the largest naval air station. That's gone. Fort Dix in New Jersey, it was the largest training of infantry. It's, by the way, named after a great Civil War leader for the North. When all those people went to Fort Hood, named for a Civil War leader for the other team in the South. And Otis Air Force Base, it was the largest in the world of aerospace for anywhere, in not just for us, but in any country. This is gone. That was up in Cape Cod. So this thing had consequences, and these were political moves. If those of you who are looking at the rebirth of Kendall Square, since you have your Cambridge friends, Kendall Square was decimated because it was supposed to be NASA's headquarters. That was supposed to be mission control because we had a president who was from Boston. He got shot, as you may remember, and we got a president from Texas. So guess where mission control went, to Texas, is that we have to really stay on guard and take a look at the political side of defense spending. And biotech, another huge success for us in life sciences. I was just did a quick interview for Channel 8 and tried to avoid talking about life sciences because I'm really worried about the new Secretary of Health and Human Services, but the interviewer was so good he made me talk about it. And I do worry about where we go from here with RFK Jr., who is a classmate of Governor Lamont and mine, who questions the efficacy of vaccines and is poised to disrupt the virtuous cycle of development in science. I mean, this is somebody who has on the record said that drinking water can determine somebody's gender. This, wouldn't be my first pick for this job. He has many noble qualities in his background, but to advance science over superstition is not his strength. So we need to stay on guard what happens there. And the Biden administration has been very good for development of new drugs for Amgen and Pfizer and others. And of course, we have so many great international, national, and local life sciences companies here, but we've been number one for academic R&D support for this space in the country, number 3 for bioscience and venture capital investment. It's the number 4 state for for bioscience patents. And these are companies that you all know. Arvinus, if you know it. Craig Cruz is one of my colleagues. He started a couple companies in this space that deal with proteins that spread disease and how they break them down. It's companies. AstraZeneca, of course, has been wonderful as they've backed Alexion in a great partnership, keeping them here. Pfizer, obviously, not too far from where we are right now, and this was at the expense of their big Ann Arbor facility. They shut down, and Pfizer still has made their investments, here in this state. Is the Biohaven, amazing company. This Nurtec drug, this one drug, the founder, Vlad Korik, sold, all the press except for Greg got it wrong. They said they're selling biotech to Pfizer. No, he only sold one drug to Pfizer for $13 billion. One drug. It hadn't yet been proven. It's doing very well for Pfizer right now, but he's tripled in his market value in the 2 years since he sold that one drug. That's Biohaven here, and he's investing so much in other companies and coming along in this area. This is such a great strength, and you got Boehringer Ingelheim with, I don't know, a third of their global revenues here, a great German company. So life sciences, there's so much to be proud of, but we do worry about what could happen. The positive is the Biden administration had an antitrust policy that some thought was not globally competitive, that somehow big was always bad. And a lot of these life sciences companies expect an exit strategy. Lena Khan, as the head of the Federal Trade Commission, and Jonathan Cantor, the head of the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division, weren't so good at this side. And so there's some positive side. The downside is what RFK Jr. might do, but there are some positives. FinTech and finance, this is another huge employment source for us. It's just 107,000, actually I think it's about 110,000 now. Number one of any state in concentration of financial talent, and this is after the implosion and now the rebirth of cryptocurrency, with over 5,400 financial companies contributing $30 billion to the state's GDP. And this has significant implications of the elections. I just went to a book party last night for Anthony Scaramucci, who is one of these kings of cryptocurrency. And Anthony, who's happened to be a big Harris supporter. Everybody else in the group was not, because they're all cryptocurrency fanatics, and they're quite excited about the clearance time that under the Democrats, Gensler, who I thought was great, was not revered by a lot of the FinTech crowd for putting in so many protections and guardrails and slow, careful development of the crypto space. So that will be good for the state. Hopefully it's good for the country. But we're going to see a lot of faster development of what happens with exchanges, with new products, and the rest in the crypto space. The venture capital landscape, by the way, continues to flourish here, something we're quite proud of. The VC technology ecosstructure, if you just think of the breadth, as Connecticut Innovations continues to scale up innovations across Connecticut and helping them. And here's in some of the space where this goes, and that it's in at all different stages, but especially critical in early life stages in healthcare and tech, areas that just play to the state's strengths. That the money is going to where Connecticut is strong. Advanced manufacturing is just another form of technology, of course, having to do with being an epicenter for clean energy. I know you've all seen the equivocation about what we do about wind, and wind is right now, as a new technology, is so much more expensive than the carbon-free technology that has the risks of nuclear. And the governor is recognizing nuclear is so much more efficient, and yet still that this state has the highest concentration of offshore wind jobs in the U.S., number 3 for offshore wind power generated, number 2 in clean energy patents, and number 3 for fuel patents. And the fiscal stimulus has been great for this, especially the IRA, but even in the EV market. Those rechargers, who do you think makes them? Amphenol, a company that all of you should know, but I bet a lot of you don't know. It's larger than any company I've mentioned here in terms of their impact in the state. They have 200,000 employees globally, but they make the connectors in cell phones and Boeing cockpits and everything, but they're also at the middle of all the EV recharging stations. And the IRA has been very good for that. The Infrastructure Act and the CHIPS Act also have some great value for us. Basically, in that legislation, it's about $1.5 trillion that Biden and the Congress cleared, and the Treasury Department has been so creaky slow in getting it out that most of that's going to pay out. 95% of that will be paying out in the first year of Trump's administration. If the new legislature doesn't recall it, it's going to be a windfall for Trump to say, look what I've done. Sadly, Joe Biden will get no credit for it, but it's pretty impressive, and a lot of that will tie in to infrastructure here. This state alone will be, $6 billion we'll be going to be getting for much-needed highway construction and things. As you can see, in Metro North, we already have those faster trains with more coming, the express trains and things. And these are some of the great advanced manufacturers, so many others to put up here, but these are companies that you all know their names. We celebrate them. Microboard, it's a fascinating story of, if you don't know her, is Nicole Russo, has a top defense contractor, and they actually they're microelectronics that she makes them here, and she took the company over from her dad, doing a fabulous job. And then finally, just on the closing where John closed, is diversity. We're making some progress on this. It's about a third improvement in terms of the racial concentration. We are the most educated workforce, in many dimensions. Number 2 in public education quality. Number 3, the employees with advanced degrees. We have 38 state colleges and universities, a lot to be proud of. And here's the twist where it looks like I'm disagreeing with John, but I'm completely agreeing with him. It's a sleight of hand on the statistics that John would point out. But I'm saying, hey, yeah, it's the under 18 where we're doing really well, but those are the ones you say we're at risk losing, is that, yes, we have an aging population here of 55 plus, which sounds young to me, but it's to hold on to these 18-year-olds is a great gem if we can keep them here in the state. And the spin-outs from the universities are just fantastic. Yale and UConn with collaborative development, and Greg, when we were just sitting at the table, was just telling me about some stuff that maybe we can get to, Greg, in the panel if I've left you any time, and that is to take a look at some of the new areas of computing that and where Yale and cooperation with the state have made a big difference. But it's a summary. The Trump-driven turbulence in these 5 sectors are critical to Connecticut's economy: defense, life sciences, fintech and finance, advanced manufacturing, emerging technologies, workforce development, and education. But there's still plenty to be optimistic about. In the last half-decade, business leaders working with this administration have quietly played an underappreciated but significant role in reviving Connecticut as a premier destination for business, large and small. Nobody makes those jokes anymore when you hop in a taxi, a limo driver, talk to friends in other states, or an Uber. This is a can-do state that people are proud to be here. Before you even get to the gorgeous countryside that nobody can rival, there have also been over 100,000 new jobs created in Connecticut with about $100 billion of investment. These are great wins. Now, if any of you happen to see some tweets that I was quoted in, there is sort of a downside of a couple of challenges. Just between us, we did really badly investing our pensions. We had a treasurer, and I don't want to point a finger at her, but I just did, who was very open in pointing out tremendously accurate indictments of governance failures around the country when we saw governance collapses and scandals in the turn of this century. And she was right. But we all presumed that the governance inside our treasurer was as good as the issues that she was raising on the outside. Nobody that you know in your life ever did what volunteers did working with us, is that student volunteers, we went through and did apples to apples. And Greg looked at this data quite carefully to figure out where are the assets and oranges to oranges for all 50 states. Nothing exists. Bloomberg doesn't have anything. Thomson Reuters doesn't have anything. FactSet doesn't exist. We created it painstakingly, and to find out all the hidden fees that are there and who the asset managers are, we found out Connecticut on a 1-year, 3-year, 5-year, 15-year, and 20-year horizon is the second worst in the nation in terms of returns. That if we got just average, we could have more than cut taxes in half. Wouldn't that made your jobs and all these economic fields a lot easier? If we could have cut taxes in half if we just got the average return. We didn't get anywhere near it. We have a new treasurer. He's made tremendous strides, great headways, and there's some very good numbers out. So we're now moving up towards middle of the pack, and I salute them. There's more that can be done there. I don't want to dwell on that later in terms of how this happened, what can be done. The good news is we're on the right path now, and I should turn the floor over. You didn't pull out a hook or throw a tomato or anything yet, but thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm so honored to join you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I really enjoyed that. And I'm going to call the other panelists up here. John's going to come up and rejoin us, and we're going to do a couple additional introductions. On the panel, joining the professor and John, we're going to have Irma Esparza Diggs, who is the Senior Executive and Director of Federal Advocacy for the National League of Cities. Irma leads NLC's grassroots and lobbying efforts. She has a variety of experience in public and private and nonprofit sectors, specifically in key positions in federal and municipal government, including the Chief of Staff of the Office of Legislative and Congressional Affairs at the Department of Education, along with other congressional and executive branch work. She was also the Executive Director of the U.S. House Democratic Caucus. At the time of her work there, the chairman of the caucus was Congressman John Larson. And joining her on the panel will be Chris Davis, who is the Vice President of Public Policy of the Connecticut Business and Industry Association, our friends at CBIA. Chris oversees CBIA's planning and execution of public policy, strategy, and initiatives. Chris previously represented the General Assembly's 57th House District, which includes East Windsor and Ellington, for 5 terms. During his tenure, he served as ranking member of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. Amongst his legislative accomplishments include being one of the architects of the 2017 bipartisan fiscal reforms that led to the state's current fiscal strength. Prior to CBIA, Chris also served as a manager of public affairs for the Connecticut Lottery Corporation. So they make up our panel of 4, and our moderator today, who probably needs no introduction with most of you, is Greg Bordenaro, who is the editor of the Hartford Business Journal. So Greg, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Oh, I think yours.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody, for being here today, and thanks, Jeff and John, for your presentations so far. I just wanted to start by giving Irma and Chris about 5 minutes to do some introductions and some opening remarks. So, Chris, can you, or Irma, do you want to get started first?
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. It is good to be with you today. I thank you for both those presentations. I feel like I need to throw mine out the window and start all over. And I say that because there was a lot of good information that came your way, and what I want to do in these 5 minutes of my introductory remarks, and then I know we'll get to a question and answer, is put some context, if you will. So I work for the National League of Cities, which represents 19,000 cities, towns, and villages. I am the chief lobbyist for the National League of Cities, and frankly, am your contract lobbyist, if that's an easier way to think about it. And I work with a team of 7 issue advocates that are very much the issue area experts. And just a little context for you or understanding of how I come to this. So I've been with NLC for 8 years and have led during, I started right at the beginning of the Trump administration, served during the Biden administration in this role, and now back again during the Trump administration. And during that period, there was the pandemic. And in my 30 years of working in Washington, both on the executive branch and the legislative branch, and then managing multiple campaigns across the country, nothing ceases to amaze me anymore. And one of the things that is always important, especially as I do this job every day, is to keep front and center and focused on what you do and bringing those local government sensibilities and practical solutions that you are employing to address real issues that your residents are dealing with, bringing that perspective to Washington. And during the pandemic, one of the things that we saw was because of the national shutdown, because it was a national crisis, the implications on local government were real. And by that, I mean the spigot had been closed in terms of operating revenues coming in to sustain your budgets, and very tough decisions were made. And Congress knew very little about your day-to-day functions, up to and including Senate leadership declaring that municipalities could just declare bankruptcy in absence of direct federal relief. So I say that to you all because we fought long and hard during that national shutdown, wrote the legislative text ourselves that brought you the State and Local Recovery Fund through the American Rescue Plan Act. I bring that to you and remind you of the State and Local Recovery Fund because for the first time in history, every municipal government received a direct federal grant. It was during a time of a national crisis, and it was meant for to help you build back as a result and meet the needs of your public health, public safety, and overall fiscal health. As a result, you all use that funding to stabilize your government operations, to address and meet your housing needs, your public safety needs. And what we did during that time is we went into education mode, really helping you dollar for dollar understand how to use that federal funding to also meet your infrastructure needs, your water, broadband, sewer, and later transportation and disaster. But we've been telling that story, not just in working closely with the federal agencies on what you needed in order to effectively use that funding and the flexibility, but frankly to change how Washington thinks about federal funding and not just giving it directly to the states, but giving it directly to you. And as a result, we had some tremendous successes with the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, which for the first time in history, there is more money going directly to local governments than ever before. And I know my colleague Kiana Taylor with the Local Infrastructure Hub talked about the boot camps. I just want to underscore that regardless of the outcome of the election and who will occupy the White House, even though it will be President-elect Trump, there is still a slim majority in the House and the Senate. So there will need to be compromise. And the president-elect will still have the job to do of running government, and all of that congressional appropriated funding for infrastructure, for these climate provisions will still have to take place. You all still have an opportunity to utilize those federal funds to really make an impact in your community. And this local infrastructure hub, which names some very critical programs, is direct funding that you can apply for now. What this election said is that people are hurting economically. Wages have not kept in place or kept on track or in line with inflation. It costs way too much to buy a gallon of milk and everything else, and people are feeling the pain. And I think that's why you see this market shift, even in traditionally very blue core areas. And so as the chief executives for your respective communities, what I would encourage you all to do, and just know that we here at the National League of Cities are here to do, is to help you really utilize federal funds to help create workforce opportunities for your residents. to really address your housing needs, and how can you use these infrastructure dollars, these climate dollars, these direct pay provisions, which allows for the municipality to take a tax credit to build infrastructure projects, how it is that you can use these dollars to bring jobs, to invest in your local infrastructure, to generate a return on investment. The additional context that I want to give you is that we do have a growing federal deficit, a federal debt that is going to have to be addressed. President-elect Trump will have a trifecta. Republicans will occupy the White House, the Senate, and the House, and they are going to use reconciliation, which is a way to circumvent the 60 votes needed in the Senate to be able to move some key priorities. First up will be tax policy. I want to remind you all, when the tax provision or bill was passed last go around, cities lost our ability to do advance refunding, which is your ability to refinance your municipal bonds. We also lost the state and tax deduction, the SALT deduction, which allowed for your residents to take that mortgage interest deduction and increase the standard deduction. And so for those higher wage states like Connecticut and the District of Columbia, those residents in the upper middle class brackets have really felt the pain not being able to take that mortgage interest deduction. But what's on the table now is the possibility of elimination of the tax-exempt municipal bond status. So that tax-exempt status for municipal bonds, which is how you finance many of your capital infrastructure projects, right now is on the table. And so it remains to be seen how the tax package, any energy package, but also anything on immigration, how those things will be financed in the new Congress. Right now, Congress has on its to-do list its budget appropriations. The continuing resolution goes through December 20th, so it's December 4th, just in a few weeks. And then right after, we have Christmas and Hanukkah taking place on the same day. And so the last thing, as residents and the population in America is hurting economically, we need is a government shutdown. And so the test will be for Congress to be able to pass a continuing resolution or a budget bill. Right now, it looks like they are discussing a continuing resolution that will just fund the government at existing levels through possibly March. If I had to bet my money, I think that's where we end up. Which will then give the Senate leadership, new Senate leadership at that time, really an opportunity for them to pass their budget priorities moving in the new year. And so the Defense Act right now is on Congress's to-do list. That is really important because that impacts pay raises for military personnel, again, an economic issue. The Farm Bill also has to get done. It's already 1 year past the extension. That will impact milk prices, dairy prices. So there is many things before Congress, also disaster relief appropriations. There are many things before Congress right now that has to get done before the end of the year that will have economic consequences. This will be the real first test for Speaker Johnson in the House, but also President Trump, President-elect Trump, who is working right now to unify his party around him and his agenda, because that's what it's going to take for him to be successful. What we are going to be doing, and as an association, is helping you all to maximize these federal infrastructure projects, to staying on guard, watching what's happening and what the implications are for local governments, especially as it relates to the tax package. It is important that you all communicate with your congressional delegation, as well as your residents. Right now in the Senate is working to fast track a Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, which governs your workforce investment boards. The package is not friendly to local governments. Most of that authority goes to state governments. So we're hopeful, and please, if you haven't reached out to Senator Murphy, Senator Blumenthal, please express your concerns. Happy to share. We'll share with the league the letter with what the concerns are in that workforce bill. But it's all about, everything is about documenting the impact of the federal dollars in your respective communities and what that return on investment is. I will stop there, and I look forward to being part of the panel, but frankly, continuing to work with you to just make sense of Washington's new government, but frankly, understanding how we leverage a very slim majority in the Senate and the House to maintain federal funding that is going to work to drive your local economies. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you, Irma. Chris?
Very constructive.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. I think to give a little bit of a perspective on the state elections and its impact on cities and towns, and also on our local economies as well. But I just want to begin by thanking the organization, CCM, for all the work that you do, especially around the 119K Commission that we at CBIA worked very closely with, and I see Mayor Hoydick in the back and one of the chairmans of that, and former colleague of mine in the House. Great to see you. And the importance of workforce development here in the state of Connecticut, and we really appreciate the fact that our local cities and towns have really leaned into that and that work on the 119K Commission, and working with the Dalio Foundation and others to try to find those pathways for those disconnected youth here in Connecticut that could really help solve some of the workforce challenges that John and Professor Sonnenfeld mentioned earlier today. And I know that my colleague, Dustin Nord, who is our CBIA Foundation Director, has presented to your board, and I think several other members, of our Opportunity Connecticut long-term economic plan that we put out back in September. It was a long process, over a year, of over 30 economic forums across the state of Connecticut, with many of you in this room participated in those forums, along with local business leaders, educational leaders, others, to come up with a plan for the state of Connecticut that is long-term, and it's outside of government, from the private sector's view, that can really be a living document through the CBIA Foundation and its interactions with each and every one of you throughout going forward, in order to try to implement some of these plans that we have to try to spur economic growth and competitiveness here in the state of Connecticut. Because at the end of the day, business needs stability, we need predictability, and we need sustainability in order to make those investments in the state of Connecticut. And without some sort of long-term vision and ability to get there in a really reasonable way, working with our cities and towns and with our state, it's impossible. So it's very important that we work with all of you. If you have not read the report, I highly suggest it. It's called Opportunity Connecticut. It's the CBI Foundation. Be happy to come and present to you locally as well to talk about it. But a number of different measurements in there looked at best practices around the country, at other cities and other towns, and how we can really drive economic growth here in Connecticut by looking at what some of these other states are doing and what some of these other towns are doing. So getting that public sector local buy-in on a number of different issues, including permitting, timelines, and visibility. It's very important for the business community to know that if they put in an application for some economic growth, that there's a timeline and that it can be done in a certain amount of time, so they can staff up and be able to make those investments within their capital windows. Very important. Buy-in from and Professor Sonnenfeld mentioned them before, Advanced CT, who we work very closely with in trying to develop that economic development, working with your economic developers, directors in each one of your towns, also a very important thing. And then working with our educational leaders in each one of your towns to get that skills-based learning happening and to build that workforce that we desperately need here in Connecticut. And we really have to work to fill that gap, because we're looking at 1.4 job openings for every job seeker here in Connecticut. We have a very low unemployment rate, as as our presenters mentioned, 3%. But we also have only 0.5% job growth here in Connecticut, and that's way behind our neighbors. It's also way behind the national average as well. So how do we get there? How do we move the needle? And really, a lot of it comes around workforce development and being able to get those young people, disconnected youth, incarcerated individuals back into the workforce. All of these things can be done both at the state and local level. But looking at the state election and its impacts, we have now supermajorities in both the House and the Senate. It's the lowest number of House Republicans that they've had in over 15 years. It's the lowest number of Senate Republicans in almost 25 to 30 years. This is a different environment for Governor Lamont going into this next session. And the real question mark for many is what role do the moderates play? And Governor Lamont is a moderate Democrat. And what role do they play in shaping policy going forward? And us at CBIA, we work very closely with moderates on both sides of the aisle to kind of build that coalition with our Reimagine CT pledge that we had them all sign during the election season, and trying to work on those areas that we can kind of pull them both together and really have some real successes on the economic development front. But it will be a challenge, and one of the biggest challenges will be the fiscal guardrails and the battles over that. We saw that last session with the lack of a budget from the state of Connecticut, lack of change for many of you on your municipal funding, and what impact that will have going forward with this new budget session with a large amount of influence being put on to change those fiscal guardrails and the impacts that they have had. And we have seen nothing but success from those fiscal guardrails. There's significant amount of money has been able to be reinvested into each one of your communities because of the money that we were able to save through those fiscal guardrails. And without them, it would have cost us just on the pension benefit contributions over $700 million a year would have had to go to that instead of going to each one of your cities and towns. So, I mean, this is real impactful things that are going to be coming up this session that we'll be talking about, and the importance of keeping those in place in order to have those investments for each one of your towns going forward. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Chris. I want to keep it on the budget discussion. What are going to be the big arguments? Obviously, the fiscal guardrails are going to sort of overhang everything, but what are the big arguments in terms of spending priorities are there going to be within the budget, and any other issues that cities and towns should be looking at outside the budget?
Yeah, so what you see under the spending cap, each year it gets readjusted based on either personal income growth or inflation. Last few years has been based on personal income growth. So there's increases in spending. The state of Connecticut is spending more than it's ever spent before, even under these fiscal guardrails. This idea that they're constrained and they're cutting, it's not actually factual. But it becomes priorities, and this is where it becomes very challenging coming off of a budget cycle where ARPA funding was available for a lot of you at the city and town level, but also importantly for the higher education sector here in Connecticut, where hundreds of millions of dollars in ARPA funds were redirected to higher education, oftentimes not spent on one-time expenses like many of you did in your towns, instead on ongoing expenses. So that's going to be a major struggle coming back and trying to find ways to fill that funding. Cost overruns continue to grow in a number of different sectors within the budget. Medicaid expansion has led to hundreds of millions of dollars more in needed funding for Medicaid expenses. You have other cost overruns like in overtime and other departments that have really chewed into what's available for that additional spending allowed under the spending cap. So you're going to have a real battle next year, and which is why this discussion about the fiscal guardrails is going to be so prominent again. Because there is increased spending available. It's just a matter of where those resources and priorities go. And when you look at trying to replace those ARPA funds and then trying to match those fixed costs that have increased, it chews up a significant portion, if not all of the available additional spending. So that battle is going to be one that I think brings us right up to the brink in June on where we go as far as state spending goes.
Sure. I just want to open up the next question to all the panelists. We haven't talked too much about housing, but I think we've all come to realize that housing is a huge economic issue, workforce development issue. How big of a factor is housing, on Connecticut's economy, and what can cities and towns do to grow, housing within their communities when obviously, there's a lot of pushback against some of that development? Anybody who wants to take that?
I jump in just because I think my fellow panelists have the answer, so I'll just add to the problem. Gene in particular, I think you have some good answers in mind on this. But on housing, I'm on the board of Lennar's, the nation's largest or second largest home builder. We have conservatively 20% of the labor done by our contractors and subcontractors is undocumented, we believe, but it's not ours. But immigrant labor can run as high as about 80%. And of course, agricultural, this is not your issue right now, it's about half that, but it's quite high. That's going to have a big impact. Lumber, up until recently, was down 95% from where we were, well below pre-COVID. A lot of supplies are much lower, but now it's reversing because we're seeing, in anticipation of Trump-era inflation, there are some big anticipatory jumps, and lumber is now going back up again. But a really big concern, though, is mortgage rates. That sitting next to a banker, it's intimidating to say this, but I bet even in John's storied career, he can't think of a time where the Fed is so dramatically cutting rates and the long-term bond is going the opposite way because they're afraid. And mortgage rates, this is hurting us in the home builders. We thought that mortgage rates would be around 4.5%, 5% right now. It's going from 6 to 7%. And that's because people are fearing the bond business is apparently afraid of inflation coming. So these are, major concerns from whether or not it's on tariffs, on supplies, it's on lost labor, or it's on the mortgage prices. So frankly, there's an article that just came out in the Washington Post as we began this panel, which I can't open to read, but it says basically that the housing market's going to get a lot more expensive in the near future.
Yeah, my office is in Southport, and when I'm hiring staff, I have to understand the traffic flows and all the rest, because for some people, I had a woman who worked for me who lived in Naugatuck, and she said it's taken me over. She moved up there because she could afford the home, but then it took her an hour and 10 minutes to get to our office, so I lost her. So, that the housing issue is big for employers, because it limits the geographic pool that you can pull employees from. It's a big problem for a small business, or a big bank. I worked for People's Bank, and we had the same issue, trying to find people, making sure that we could bring them in. So, the housing issue is a big problem. My wife and I have 4 kids. 2 older ones moved to New York. They're paying the same in rent in New York that they would be paying if they lived in Fairfield. For some places. So you can sit there and say, well, gee, Connecticut's so much cheaper than New York. No, in a lot of instances it isn't. So building that affordable housing to get that workforce in here is going to be
Chris and Irma will fix it for us.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll say, workforce and housing are directly tied together, and we've seen that play out here in Connecticut with the shrinking labor force that we have, in part because of the unaffordability of housing. But it's also the scarcity of housing. And we're sitting here in southeastern Connecticut where Electric Boat is trying to hire 5,000 individuals a year. They have nowhere for them to live. There's nowhere in eastern Connecticut because of just development over time hasn't provided the infrastructure in order to have this multifamily development that's necessary for that type of job growth, right? So then where do we look at single family housing development and other kind of middle housing developments that can be taking place in a lot of these smaller towns that have the infrastructure and ability to do that. That's kind of where I think a lot of the solutions are going to be heading towards. We saw some movement in that last session at the legislature towards middle housing, especially for these cities and towns that don't have the infrastructure to build large-scale multifamily developments. But from what we hear from our developers that are members of CBIA, is the struggles that they have doing one development in one town and then trying to do something similar in another town and having to restart the entire process all over again every single time, and then having different rules and regulations in each town through their planning and zoning departments and others to then have to go through a different type of permitting process and not being able to replicate that development across different towns. Those that operate in other states do that quite regularly, where they can develop similar types of projects in similar towns and move them around the different state in order to meet the needs of the workforce. So that's a struggle that we have to work on both at the state and local level to try to improve that permitting process and the visibility for businesses to know how that process is going to work. That's really one of the ways that we can help solve some of this housing development issues. but when they're not sitting on their hands because of the high interest rates and the high cost of labor and the high cost of supply. So that's really where we as a state, working with you at the local level, can help improve that type of process and make it easier for those shared services across towns, working with your COGS perhaps, and others to try to make sure that development can take place in an effective way that is appropriate for each one of your communities.
Thank you. We have a housing crisis in this country. We have seen it nationally, and I think the issue was exacerbated during the pandemic. And it's not only are mortgages and rents unaffordable, but there's just a lack of housing supply in a lot of communities that never had this issue before. At the National League of Cities, we, for the last probably 4 years, have been working on this effort. We just released, if you Google NLC Housing Supply Accelerator, we just released a playbook that identifies best practices. So what is it that local communities are doing to increase housing supply? So some of those suggestions related to permitting, something as simple as creating a standard template that developers can use that are already pre-approved that help to expedite the process of building. So what are those local solutions that is embedded in that playbook? We also brought to the table the home builders, the planning association, the realtors, and we've been having one conversation. This last year we held, I believe it was like 8 convenings across the country to talk through the issues, and we talked about everything from financing to actually building and workforce, and all of that complicates, right? How to build housing. But the reality is that I feel like more local elected officials feel like they have to themselves be the developers. It's not what your expertise is doing. And so having one conversation with the ecosystem that's responsible for building housing is a first step. We now are taking that to the next level and working to build a federal agenda, including bringing to the table the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, because housing is going to have to be an issue that the president-elect addresses this new Congress, because it is of crisis proportions in small rural communities and communities that have never felt it before. And so be on the lookout for not just solutions that you can employ, but how to inform what it is you need with your senators and with your members of Congress, being able for them to connect the dots about what you're doing at the local level, what changes you're making, but also what are the state resources and supports and partnership that exists or may not exist to the fullest extent that you'd like to see it, and what do you need from the federal government. That is a priority for the National League of Cities that we are going to be focused on, and more importantly, how do you use federal infrastructure funding, how do you use the lack of workforce funding, but all of that to help meet some of these housing needs, I think is a potential solution. So a lot more on that to come, but we have a starting place, and that's the housing playbook that you all should feel free to read.
And Irma, just to follow up, I know there was a bill kicking around in Congress that would create incentives for developers who would convert office buildings, which is another issue for a lot of towns are facing. It's stalled in Congress to basically incentivize office conversions to residential. Is there any likelihood that the Trump administration would move forward with that, given his development background and maybe his developer pals asking to support this kind of thing?
Yes, and which is why I said that I very much see in the post-inaugural, I wouldn't be surprised if immediately January 3rd, President Trump, or President-elect Trump will still be President-elect then, will announce his agenda early on with the new Congress coming in, because of the need to have that solidarity to be able to move things early on. And so having a housing package be part of that overall agenda, we at the National League of Cities are going to put forward our our own economic agenda that will include housing, workforce, and some of the other things that we have been working on the last few years, including making government work for smaller local government is going to be front and center in that agenda. And so not just incentivizing developers, but also creating tax credits to encourage development and other projects like that, but which is why it's important that those different stakeholders that aren't traditionally aligned, that are often at odds in communities, having one conversation is going to be important, because it is a Hail Mary pass to be able to, at this point, to get anything passed through Congress.
Sure. I want to talk a little bit more about economic development. Jeff, I was wondering if you could share some insights of how cities and towns could work with an organization like Advocacy for business recruitment and, getting more companies to cities and towns and to Connecticut overall.
I think Chris addressed this in a far more diplomatic way than I would, because he's sensitive to the audience. But having 169 municipalities is hard in a state this size, and with everybody with separate zoning issues, as Chris was alluding to, and other kinds of regulatory issues, is a challenge. And how do we collaborate? The word regionalization gets to be a bad word for a lot of people, but still collaboration and partnership. While it was perhaps controversial in New York, every other part of the country wanted that second headquarters for Amazon. Is when Advanced CT was in its earlier form, we hadn't yet called ourselves that, hadn't reorganized, and it was a little bit more too passive an organization, well-intended, but frankly not doing a lot. All you folks went off on your own. And Jeff Bezos, and I know this personally from him, and Ingenuity, who found this out as she joined the board, a great Connecticut enthusiast of ours, former CEO of PepsiCo, they got 6 applications from 6. Stanford was competing against Hartford. They're competing, against Greater New Haven and things, and it was confusing to them. But we should have had a statewide pitch. And I'm not saying that everybody had to say that Amazon was the right answer, but there are examples like that in terms of economic opportunity, where in the past we used to work against each other instead of working collaboratively. Of a state this size, which is the size of a very, very large city, we should work together in collaboration. So that's one way. Another is to not point fingers across sectors. We had a mistaken assumption of some that represented some of the more vocal part of the Democratic Party, fell into a lot of 1930s cliches of which side are you on. Economic development at the DNC, I was at the Democratic National Convention for all 4 days of it, for all 26 hours. Only 3 people spoke about economic development there. It was Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Sean Fain, the head of the UAW. They all spoke very well, but they spoke incorrectly. All of them were vilifying business. Nobody else spoke about business but those 3. There are other important issues they talked about, but is taking a look at what they did was they pointed to price gouging, and of which there's hardly any. There are 3 bakery companies that control 70% of baked goods in the country. That's a problem. PBMs and healthcare, that's a problem. But grocers were not responsible for the runaway prices in eggs that had to do with losing a third of the chicken population, hen population, because of avian flu. And to go out and beat up on grocers that are making 1 to 1.5% profit margin was not the way to do it. And some in elected office and some municipal leadership, picked up on the spirit of finger pointing. And again, we do best when we all work on the same side.
Can I expand on that? On December 19th, I'll make this presentation to the Boston Biotech Society. And, Kendall Square, that whole group.
It's back alive again. I forgot to finish the story. You're right.
Yeah, it's booming. But if, as Jeff really laid out very nicely, if the biotech boom that's taking place right around Yale stays in New Haven, it will never be a boom. If you take a look at Massachusetts, that's the blueprint. You've got a lot of R&D, you've got a lot of research going on in Kendall Square and the environs. But take a drive out to Worcester, Massachusetts. On Route 9, which is like, the post road of Worcester, there are phenomenal companies out there in the biotech space, the medical space. They're taking those great inventions and saying, okay, let's not go down to South Carolina, let's stay in Massachusetts and let's produce the product here. So if your state or your town is right around New Haven, great, but every town in Connecticut should be thinking about how do we leverage what's going on in New Haven and not have those walls that Jeff was just talking about, but think about how do we leverage this? And how do we take advantage of what's going on in Massachusetts? Because it's not just Boston, it's spread throughout the state and really driven job growth and driven their economy.
We're running close to time. Before I ask one more topic, any questions from the audience? You could come up and use one of the mics.
Or complaints. As you're approaching the mic, I just want to say that Chris is also too modest to say that CBIA had a recent contest as to what is the coolest product made in the state, and the right answer was?
Electric boats.
Electric boats, Virginia class, right? Submarines, and it's so good for you.
Incredibly tight race between that and the Black Hawk helicopter made in Sikorsky down in Stratford. So you can imagine that was a battle down to hundreds, I think, votes out of tens of thousands. So it was a very interesting time.
Hi, Mary Clorio. I'm the town manager for the town of Killingly, up in the northeast corner, very close to Massachusetts, and we do see a lot of interest in development in our area because of the close proximity to Boston and also other markets. But with that, we also have housing crisis. And yes, housing is a first step, but I would actually back it up to one more step below that. Infrastructure is key. One of the struggles that we are facing in our community right now is our wastewater treatment plant was built in the early 1970s. We're out of capacity. We've actually had to put a moratorium on connections. How do we fund a capacity increase? It's $45 million. That is just too much of a lift for our current sewer users. We've been desperately trying to access for the last several years federal infrastructure money in order to be able to do this significant upgrade that needs to happen, we've known is coming down the pike. But that's hamstringing not just Killingly, it's also Brooklyn. We're the sole wastewater treatment plant for our neighboring town, Brooklyn, right? And I bring this up only because it's not just a Killingly thing. Many of our plants across the state were built in that same time frame. And as we want to encourage this development and growth, more of these communities are gonna run into that same blockade. And you can streamline your zoning, your application, your permitting, all of that as much as possible. But ultimately, if your ground can't manage a septic system, which much in the northeast corner can't because we are a lot of ledge, you need sewer infrastructure. And if you don't have the way to increase those capacities and manage that treatment opportunity, we've already lost businesses that wanted to land. We couldn't take them. We've already had housing developments that can't connect. We even have, the small mom and pop, the kid that wants to add the secondary housing dwelling unit on their property to get mom and dad here. They can't connect. How do we leverage that to be able, and it has to be a larger solution, but, it can't be a 10-year out solution, because we're, we're way behind on being able to address that. So I just say, in all of your pitches at the federal and the state level, don't forget that underlying infrastructure component, because you can build as much housing as you want. Ultimately, if you can't handle that wastewater or that bottom line infrastructure, you're dead in the water.
Yeah, and like I mentioned before, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, especially here on the eastern side of the state and in the northwest corner, is just the infrastructure doesn't exist for this type of development. And I think that it comes down to what we talked about before in the question that Greg asked about the budget challenges, and where are the priorities. We see doing this report, Opportunity Connecticut, we looked at best practices in other states, and talk to our business leaders and about the pitches that they're receiving on a daily basis from other states. And one of the things that differentiates what Connecticut has done in the past, at least, and what these other states are offering is infrastructure improvements and funding to build out that sewer line to their plant, to build out that natural gas line, to build that road. That's what the states and the local municipalities and the counties in many of these other states are offering to these towns. Not saying we're just going to throw a bunch of tax credits at you and a bunch of cash at you. We're actually going to provide you the playing field for you to be able to build the facility that you need or build the housing that you need for your workforce, and then you come and provide those jobs and going forward. So those are the types of things that I think as a state, I think Governor Lamont's starting to move us in that direction and looking at those things and trying to move away from some of those past practices that really didn't lead to the economic growth that we wanted to see here in Connecticut. But we need more of that, and we need to be looking at those best practices in other states, and one of the biggest ones is that infrastructure improvement, and that can be done through bonding, which is, we have some capacity to still be able to do that and still be able to afford that, and those are those long-term investments that can be passed along to the towns. That's exactly what bonding's for. It's for those infrastructure improvements. It's not for some of these other things that we're spending money on. It's for those, so it comes to the prioritization of where state government and then ultimately local government through your own bonding processes, what do you want to spend that money on?
And I'm happy to share my contact information. That's one of the areas of discussion where we went deep into is the lack of overall infrastructure, because the willingness is there. The problem is that the infrastructure is either so old that it won't hold it, the new development, or frankly doesn't exist, and nothing exists there. One of the answers or solutions is being able to, the regional cooperation, the state, this shared responsibility, shared investment, but bringing people to the table. And what we are seeing is many local leaders are the drivers or impetus of convening that table and bringing everybody to the table and saying, okay, what are all the tools that you each have at your disposal, and how can we leverage that to help address the underlying investment that it's going to take to build that new water system, and what is your role in it versus what my role is, and let's be on the same page and work on a shared timeline, if you will, where we're going to hit these markers so that when it comes time, everybody does what they can do so that we can have this infrastructure built in order to begin this development, which will come, because I almost feel like the housing development is already queued up, but what hasn't been is that infrastructure. So the two conversations need to catch up. But I can't underscore enough your ability to be a convener of that table and to initiate it. And I'm happy to share my contact information and put you in contact with the practitioners, the experts that I work with that are doing this work on a daily basis and working with leaders like yourselves from across the country. Thank you.
Good morning, Mark Nelson, Town Manager in Simsbury. Thanks very much. It was an interesting panel, great discussion. I heard two things that I was wondering if you could just spend a minute juxtaposing them for me on inflation. So we saw one chart where inflation is cooling, and we're kind of excited to hear that. And then we've also heard mention of the so-called Trump inflationary likelihood is my term. And so I'm having trouble juxtaposing those. Are we really saying that we expect inflation to stop cooling and go up? And then as a follow-up to that, if I could get a little more clarification on how wage inflation may act differently from what we all view as just, the price of a consumer basket of goods, or, a COLA increase or something like that. At the municipal level, one of the biggest drivers of our expenses is our labor costs. Those are fixed costs, often, collective bargaining agreements that are made, in our case, for 3 or 4 or even 5 years. So if you could just spend 60 seconds on that. And again, thanks very much.
I'd join that if I can, and have the panel unwind it and correct it after I make a mess of it. We have 6 hours, right? That's such a great question. One element of it is we're celebrating the Federal Reserve either for getting it right or finally getting it right on cutting rates and this or that, and what a good job it is for bringing us the soft landing and this kind of stuff. That's really not quite right. I think Jay Powell did a pretty good job. He was late in doing the rate cuts, but he was driven by something that you talked about, where he was misguided. There's a 1950s concept that worked in the 60s and was declared dead by the National Bureau of Economic Research by 1975, called the Phillips curve. It said that there's a trade-off between wage rates and inflation. The higher the wages go up, or employment levels, basically, as employment level goes up, inflation goes up. So what Jay Powell wanted, and what Larry Summers wanted and others, was 10% unemployment to bring down inflation. Guess what didn't happen? We didn't need a 10% unemployment for inflation to fall from 7.2%, where, by the way, it was 9.6, 9.8% in UK and Germany at the same time, is that we brought it down to 2.3, 2.4%, with unemployment, as my fellow panelists have said, at 4% or at 3% here. So much for the Phillips curve. And not only was proven wrong 50 years ago, but many economic policy people were still wringing their hands, pretending it still works. It doesn't work, and we just saw it didn't work. The only thing I would have, have added on the wage issue, though, on top of that, is that in Connecticut it's a special challenge because steel workers used to get a big boost, and that would help what Chris was talking about in terms of getting employment to shipbuilding and other parts of our manufacturers. Is right now that wage gap's been dramatically closed. We saw longshoremen, dock workers get like a 50% increase, in auto workers and aeros. Other people have gotten some big, so the gap's been closing. And you're talking about municipal worker salaries too. So it's been harder to pay some of the special incentives to get people where we were trying to attract folks before. But the good news here is wage rates are now dramatically beating inflation. There's almost twice inflation. Now, for 40 years, they weren't, but only now in the last 18 months. And everything is way down. Is that J.P. Morgan and all the energy analysts were saying we're going to have oil at $430 a barrel because of Ukraine oil. Well, guess what? Only for about 10 seconds did it hit $100 a barrel. It's been between $65 and $75 a barrel. Wars, no wars, Middle East, Ukraine, but there hasn't been that kind of inflation we talked about. And every metal is down. Every corn, wheat, everything is way down below pre-pandemic prices. And we're talking about the price of milk. It's up a little bit, but not that much. It's up about 30 cents. And the mayor of Norwalk here got a lot of bad press in Norwalk because he had a McDonald's there on the highway that charged $18 for a double quarter pounder with cheese. I went there last night. It was only $9 right now. That's I shouldn't have gone there. Don't tell my wife. But it's gone down, and it's just Walmart and Target and anybody you can think of, they have 7,000 to 10,000 items have now been reduced 30 to 70%. So it's a time lag issue here. We had a supply chain problem coming out of COVID, and that led to a big boost of prices. And
Yep. That second slide that I had President Trump and Jay Powell together, and Professor Sonnenfeld mentioned that rates are up. The 10-year has moved up. The Fed started cutting rates, and rates went up. One of the reasons that we think that's happening, to answer your question, if you think back to that 1982, remember I showed you that one chart where unemployment went up to 10.8%? Well, Paul Volcker was cutting inflation, doing a very good job. Ronald Reagan got elected, said we're going to have tax cuts, we're going to get this economy going. Paul Volcker went, holy mackerel, all that hard work that I just did is going to go out the window. So we sent rates back up. So we had another spike. We had the '82 recession. Well, the economy started going, and we did keep bringing inflation down, so rates came down. What you're seeing now is people like me going, oh, holy cow. I've seen this movie before, and what you're seeing is that people are saying, okay, Trump is talking about the tax cuts, about getting the economy going, and you're starting to see people get a little nervous and say, holy cow. So we're not anticipating as many interest rate cuts from the Fed, and the pressure is going to be on Powell to very delicately navigate, bringing down inflation while also keeping the economy going. So what you're seeing right now is a real debate on Wall Street saying, is this going to be the 80, 81, 82 back-to-back recession or interest rate rise, or can we keep this going? And the jury is out. But that relationship next year, I think, is going to be the key relationship that'll tell us where the economy is going on rates and the economy going forward.
And I just would add what's going to happen with the tariffs and the implication of increasing tariffs on goods from China and Mexico, and the impact on the cost of goods overall, just daily consumer goods, and what that would be.
We are past our time, so I just want to thank our panel one last time. Jeff, John, Irma, and Chris, thanks for joining us today. And I'll pass it back to Joe.
Fantastic. Honor to join you. Thank you.